I think you all know the story of rhubarb over the Duck Dynasty clan. The father of the clan, Phil, in an interview, addressed the issue of homosexuality. Probably didn't use necessarily the language I would have used. The point was, he made the statement that he viewed it was a sin, that homosexuality was a sin. I'm going to compare what he did to Pearl Harbor. You say, how are you going to compare Duck Dynasty to Pearl Harbor? Well, Robert Harvey did that, and in his website, The American Thinker, he made this statement. Let me read it. He says, has A&E awakened a sleeping giant? While the Japanese were celebrating the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the mastermind of that attack, Admiral Yamamoto, had a sobering message for his countrymen. He said, I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant. And he was right. For the first few months, the war machine, and actually for a year or more, rolled through the Pacific, but then there was a decisive battle, the Battle of Midway. And that's when everything changed. And it was downhill for them the rest of the way. He was right, they had awakened a giant. Dr. Charles Wood equated this event with the Duck Dynasty to that change in fortune. He says for now, or for years now, the gay lobby has steamrolled over the American Christian conservative movement, humiliating us and defeating us in battle after battle. Then came the Battle of Duck Dynasty, and the gay lobby suffered a major backlash. Have they finally met their midway? The drill has become familiar, he said. Someone speaks out in favor of maintaining the tradition of marriage, which, by the way, is held by every major religion in the world, and instantly the gay rights organizations are up in arms, making threats, filing lawsuits, and mobilizing protests. Then, instead of Christians putting up a serious and reasoned resistance, there is apathy, apology, and defeat. The script is repeated over and over, time after time. This time was different. This time, millions of Christians and Americans, even some enlightened gays, said, we've had enough. We've had it with your bullying. We're mad and we're not going to take it anymore. The left was stunned, reeling backward in defeat. For the first time in a long time, they're reloading and they're retreating. End of quote from Charles Wood. Now, I don't know all the details and the accuracy of what he's saying, and whether they are really reeling the way he said, and whether this is a turning point. But I know we are engaged, here's what I do know, we are engaged in a cultural war, a culture war. If you went home last Sunday, now after church today, you're going to watch the Super Bowl. And that'll be a great activity. Last Sunday night, what was the big thing on TV? The Grammys. The Grammys. Now, what happened at the Grammys? Well, two of the leading celebrities in the nation, Madonna and Queen Latifah went and got licensed so she could do marriages. And Madonna sang Macklemore's song, which has become an anthem for gay marriages. It's called Same Love. Queen Latifah, while Madonna was singing, did the wedding of 33 couples, many of which were gay couples. People were outraged to see this at the Grammys. The culture war just keeps going back and forth, back and forth. And we're right in the middle of it. And your kids and your grandkids are right in the middle of this. Today, welcome to the culture wars, and I've tried to figure out what my main point, I've talked to you about my main point of the culture wars, but what is my main point that I want you to walk away with today? Here's what it is. How can you, our kids, we as a church, not only survive, but thrive in this culture that has lost three of its most important natural affections? Now, you say, what are those natural affections? I'm going to talk to you about those three. Because the Bible says that in the last days, they will be without natural affections. And we see it all around us, and the Grammys epitomized it last Sunday night. So, let's dig into this and see what it looks like. By way of review, we're in the second of about 7 sermons on the culture wars. Last week, we started with 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, and we're going to follow 2 Timothy 3 as we look at these culture wars. And last week, we had a warning regarding the last days. It says, but mark this. In other words, listen up. Write it in your margins. Mark this. There will be terrible times in the last days. Now, the author is going to then describe what those terrible times look like. I'm going to look at one aspect of them, one alone today, without natural affections. But we are in the last days. The last days are defined as that period of time between when Jesus first came and when Jesus is coming back in power and great glory. One has already occurred, the other we anticipate, and as we look around us, we have to believe that we are starting to get into the last hour, maybe the last minutes of the last days. Where we are, I'm not going to make predictions, but at some point, I'm going to share where I believe we are in this whole thing. I won't give you times and dates, but where we are on this sequence. Last week, we looked at the first 7 characteristics of terrible times. In verse 2, it said, people will be lovers of themselves, people will be lovers of money, they'll be boastful, they'll be proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, and unholy. So, there you were last week. Next week, by the way, I'm going to deal with one of the big questions that I believe haunts churches like ours and our young people. We've got some friends that are missionaries in England, and Darren and Joy are over there, and they talk about the fact that the young people, the teenagers, almost to a person, do not believe there's a God. And people say, well, where Europe is, that's where we're going to be real soon. And as we start to see our country, we talked about the mega churches of atheists, the atheist mega churches last week, and we just see it through our culture where there's almost a snicker when somebody says they believe there's a God. And our kids are grappling with that. Next week, I'm going to do a 2-part series on this question of, is there a God? And I'm going to attempt to prove there is a God, and I'm not going to use my Bible. Because the people that don't believe in God don't believe in the Bible. And so I can't just say, well, God created the heavens and the earth. They're not. So we're going to look at that, and then the next week, I want to see Darwin's dilemma, the problem with evolution. And so I just want to give a little kickback to some of the stuff that is so often, it's just assumed, that a settled science, that evolution works in every aspect. There is no such thing as settled science. And we're going to take a peek at that. But that comes future. I've got a lot to do yet today, so here we go. So, verse 3, it says this. Characteristic number 8, if you will. Verse 3, it says, they will be without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good. Now, I could take each one of those, and I'm not going to. I'm going to take the first one, without love. You say, why is that so important? Well, it's really, really important. This one demands just a brief peek at the Greek. If you looked at that in Greek, it would be astragos, that without natural affections. And it's not the word, you see, yours says without love. Now, that's not the normal Greek word for love. It's astragos, which you say, well, Greek words like agape love, erotic love, phileo love, yeah, those are the normal ones. But this is different. This is a word that if you were to trace some of the older translations of this word, they say, instead of without love, they have, your original King James, by the way, has it right, where it says without natural affections. That's why some of you remember this and you wonder where I got it. It's from this verse, but it's without natural affections is the best translation, I believe. Warren Wiersbe looked at this and he said there's no doubt in the place of natural love that God has put into us, we now have a good deal of unnatural love as it deals with gender and families. And so this word deals with that natural love between a man and a woman and a man, a mother to her children, children to their parents, and a few more things. You say, is it used any other place in the Scripture? One other place. Without natural affection is used in Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 31, where it says God is condemning them because of their debased spirit sexually, where it says it's gotten so bad that even their women, and by the way, when it says, and even their women are chasing other women instead of men. And he said, look, we know that guys are rotten, but he said even their women are that bad. And so that's the word that's used. And so as we frame this word, we know that God said, I made them man and woman, man and wife, husband and wife, but they've lost it. And so today, I'm going to look at without natural affection as it relates to three relationships around you. Three relationships. The first one, they are without natural affection between men and women. This is where we get into the gay and lesbian movement. What's happening in our society as part of the culture war is there is the increased normalization of gay and lesbians in our culture. And you need to remember that this is contrary to all of the major religions in the world. It's not like we Christians are the only one that believe men are to be married to women and vice versa. We're not the only ones. All of the major religions that deal with that. Now, it raises some questions that as I deal with college students, and I've talked this through, I said, what are the questions you're dealing with? Well, here, let me list some of the questions they deal with. Number one, they will say, well, weren't they born that way? Now, that is the prevailing theory today, that they were born that way. God made them that way. How can you call it perverted if God made them that way? Another question is, well, marriage, why don't we just consider marriage a civil ceremony and not a sacred, holy romance and matrimony? Or here's this question, shouldn't we avoid discriminating against them? Because the church really has some apologizing to do for the way we have treated them in the past. And our kids pick up on that, by the way. Number four, how should I treat my close friends who are gay? And increasingly within our society, as more and more young people come out, others are saying, straight kids are saying, but they are really good friends. I love them. How do I treat them? Great question. Now, here's another one. Aren't a lot of Christians being hypocritical? Because for every gay couple in the church, there are probably, let me take a stab at it, 20 heterosexual couples that are living together without the benefit of marriage. And somebody will say, and the churches say nothing about that. And the church has sacrificed the high ground on that for taking a biased position, condemning one and winking at the other. And here's the last one. And I'm sure you could make a longer list. Is it okay for my gay friends to come to church with me? Will they be welcomed and loved in this church? And if they're celibate, can they serve in this church? Those are not easy questions. You say you're going to answer them all? No, but I sure posed them all, didn't I? I'm going to tell you what I do know. Can I tell you? We often worry about what we don't know, but let's look at what we do know. Number one, the Bible clearly labels homosexuality as a sin. Pastors are afraid, many, to say this because they are afraid of offending people. And within every congregation, and I suspect today, there are those that are either gay or lesbian. People may not know it, but they do. And pastors know that, and they don't want to offend people. Now, the problem is, I wasn't called to be inoffensive. I was called to condemn sin. And so, shame on me if I don't warn you about sin. So let me just give you just a classic passage. Romans 1:24. It says, therefore, God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts. All right, sinful desires of their hearts. To sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Verse 26. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. End quote. Throughout the Bible, God starts out in Genesis chapter 1, and once man is created, God created man and woman. And He said, the man shall be joined to the woman, they shall be one, and they will produce children. That's God's plan. And it goes beyond that, because our relationship in marriage is a symbol of the relationship between Jesus Christ and His bride, the church. And so we call it sacred marriage or holy matrimony, because this is this picture of Christ and the church, His bride, His bride. So we know that, and we all agreed on that God, you can't go through the Scripture and twist it to say that it's not a sin. It is a sin. Number two, all sex outside of marriage is condemned by God. All right, so hang on. You say, well, you missed me on the first one. Well, get ready to duck on this one. All sex, that's heterosexual sex. That's sex between a couple that's dating, that's not married. It's a guy or a gal cheating on his spouse while they're married, condemned by God. It's called adultery. He talks in a broad sense of fornication. All sex outside of marriage. By the way, and Jesus also says, quoting Jesus, if you lust after a woman, you are just as guilty. And so, you got all kinds of things in here that Jesus makes it very clear that many of us may be guilty of some of these other things in our minds, if not in our actions. And it also includes those that are engaged. When I deal with couples that are engaged to be married, I said, whatever you do, don't start engaging in sin. If you've kept yourself pure, stay that way until the wedding. Okay? Otherwise, you're going to really mess things up. And so I say to our young people, that's God's plan. Purity until marriage, and then purity within the marriage bond. I'll also say, if you've broken that line, I like to talk about born-again virgins. Start all over and say, God, I messed up. But you forgive, and I commit from this point forward to live a life as you have told us when it comes to members of the opposite sex. And so for those of you that have erred, we have a forgiving God. And there's no sin He won't forgive. But then He expects us to make a change. So, as I said, the greater problem in churches like ours is not homosexuals involved in a relationship. We have to always be on the guard for heterosexual issues. Those are the ones that are most dominant. Number three, this one will be controversial. Some people are born more vulnerable to the lure of homosexuality. What do I mean by that? Tim LaHaye did a masterpiece a long time ago. And he talked about the unhappy gays. And in it, he talked about how there are certain, if you were to take the male gay population and you were to look at the temperaments of these individuals, he said they're almost all melancholy in their temperament. And there are other commonalities. But he said, one thing I have to hammer home, most homosexuals may be melancholy, but most melancholies are not homosexuals. In other words, just because you have a melancholy temperament doesn't mean you have no choice but to fall into this, because the vast majority don't. However, he said they tend to be more vulnerable. They tend to have detached fathers, they tend to be artistic, etc., etc. But you say, does that mean they are born that way? Now, I'm still old school. I don't believe they are. And yet, if you watch the media, part of the culture war is to convince you that they are born that way. So can I throw some facts at you, okay, from the U.S. government? Charles Wood said, "There is nothing the homosexual wants more than for us, you, to believe that their chosen perversion is actually genetic rather than a matter of choice." He said they've done an incredibly effective snow job on most of society, creating a situation in which most people believe their lie. They've exchanged the truth for a lie. Jerry Brown, our governor, when signing 3 bills, he dismissed sexual orientation modification as quackery. In other words, trying to convince people that they can live a straight life. Governor Chris Christie, just get both sides of the aisle, said that people are born gay. And so it's a commonly held view. But they ignore some very strong empirical evidence. I'm going to read them to you so that I get them right. And both of these statements ignore empirical evidence that for many teenagers, sexual orientation is unstable and malleable. In other words, you can guide them one direction or another. The most comprehensive study of sexuality to date is the 1992 National Health and Social Life Survey. Here's what they found: that without any intervention whatsoever, 3 out of every 4 boys who thought they are gay at 16, without any intervention, when they interviewed them again at age 25, 3 out of 4 who were convinced they were gay no longer believed they were gay. Okay? All right, now, this will raise some really interesting situations in our public schools where you can go in whatever locker room you think might be your gender at that particular time. And so this issue is right on the cutting edge. Well, let me give you another one. The Center for Disease Control, and by the way, these are not Christian surveys. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention's 2007 report on adolescent health in the United States surveyed 10,000 teenagers, no small survey, and found that the vast majority of 16-year-olds who reported only same-sex attraction reported only opposite-sex attraction 1 year later. Catch that? The vast majority who thought they were attracted to boys at 16, 1 year later, the vast majority of that group then reported they were attracted to women a year later. What we're trying to say is, I'm going to put another point up, and I came up with this morning, so it's not going to be up there. So this will be number 3.5. Exposure to a normalized homosexuality can push some youth over the edge. It's sort of like guys that are tempted toward women and they get indulged in pornography, and it pushes them. It's like those that have an inclination as pedophiles toward children, and they look at child pornography, it pushes them over the edge. And those, I believe, this is my opinion, some of you may differ. My opinion is that those that are vulnerable, when you normalize and you see it extolled as righteous, funny, and good in the media, may make that decision, especially if they're struggling with their identity. Well, let's go to the next one. This will be number 4. We all face intense sexual temptation. What do I mean by this? One of the arguments by gay men is, you have no idea how strong my temptation is. I just cannot control it. You guys have no idea. Really? I got an idea. Mine just happens to be toward women. You just need to know that. That's my vulnerability. And you guys are swell guys, but I don't care anything about y'all, sexually at least. And yet, our temptation is strong, you guys would admit. And I think it's equally strong. And let me give a 6th point. Number 6, the struggle with temptation is not to sin. All right, we're tempted all the time. Here's what I know. Jesus was tempted in all ways such as we, But what? He did not sin. So the temptation was not the sin. The yielding is the sin. And so when we look at men or women that have a gay inclination and are tempted, the question is, have they sinned, or is the practicing the sin? And I believe it's the yielding that is the sin. I believe it's the yielding. Or the lusting, but it's not the fact that, yes, we are tempted. Here's a seventh point. The issue will not go away for the local church. It's not going anywhere. We must respond in a Christ-like manner. I was golfing with Jim Smith and some other pastors, and like I said, he had his phone on, and somebody was asking, how do we deal with a celibate gay young man in our church that says he loves the Lord and wants to work with the children's ministry? We're going to, in our churches, face more and more of those questions. I do know how we should not respond, all right? Here's how we should not respond. One of the things guys like me are guilty of, and I've asked God to forgive me, is mocking people, guys that we know, who are effeminate. I remember high school, it was horrible the way we treated guys that we thought were gay. There was no Christ-like love whatsoever. We need to show them the love of Christ. They need to be welcome in our church. We also need to make sure as a church that we are not masterful hypocrites who condemn the homosexuals and just pretend that we don't see those that are involved in sex outside of marriage who are heterosexuals. We can't do that. We have sacrificed the high ground if we are only going to attack one type of sin that seems to be more abominable to us. Well, we need to welcome them to our church. I do know that. I don't have all the answers, but I do know this problem will not go away. And when we go back I go back for a board meeting at Cornerstone University, we've got a couple of things that we're working on as a university, a Christian university. What is our policy for college students? How do we deal with that? The president and myself both equally acknowledge that when we were in school, a lot of gay people, we just didn't talk about it, and nobody really labeled or addressed it. And they've always been there. How do we as a Christian college handle that? How does the church handle that? We will face that. So, without natural affections, men and women. Let me give you a second one. I believe in the last days there will be an increasing loss of natural affection between mothers and the unborn. We're talking abortion again. What is more natural than for a mother to love that baby? And not being a mom, but being married to a fine mom, it would appear that that love grows from the moment that baby is conceived. And people naturally ought to love that baby that they're carrying. A mother's natural love. And yet in America, 1.4 million a year still get aborted. By the way, since Roe versus Wade in 1973, that's 55 million babies that we have aborted. We like to look down at Nazi Germany, as well we should, for what they did, 6 million Jews, and then we look at our 55 million. Carolyn talked about how we need to be a wall defending the unborn. As people come up with all kinds of medical options and reasons and all of this, the university that I'm on, we've got a suit in the federal courts over being forced to allow, in our insurance policy there, the morning after pill to end a pregnancy. Being forced to do that as a Christian university. And this issue will not go away. It's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, one of the things that they have down at the Resource Center, and by the way, I just hope all of you, I'm not pushing it because my wife's there. I believe in the rights of the unborn. And when you look at them on an ultrasound machine, one of the things they try to do is get the girls to see their baby in real life on an ultrasound machine. So if you look at that, I always have trouble finding them, but I can actually see that baby in there. And you start looking at if people knew what was going on, a lot of times once the girls see that baby, their decision, hey, I'm not going to abort that baby. That baby's alive. Jim Mitchell has been working with me on some stuff, and he is an attorney back in Michigan and just incensed over partial birth abortion. Now let me tell you about partial birth abortion. And you say, boy, this is not going to be pleasant. No, it isn't, but we need to know what's going on. He says, in a partial birth abortion, the abortionist uses forceps to move the child into a legs-first orientation. He then pulls the baby out of the uterus until only the head remains lodged in the birth canal. The abortionist then uses a pair of scissors or knife to make an incision in the base of the child's skull, and using a suction device, he sucks the child's brains out from the skull. The abortionist then crushes the skull and delivers the dead baby intact. Okay, that's a partial birth. That's going on in our country. Now, there was a huge outrage over Dr. Kermit Gosnell in Philadelphia. He's the one, the abortion doctor. Here's what he did. He was convicted of murder for removing babies entirely from the birth canal and then using a pair of scissors to snip their spinal cords at the back of the neck and then killing them. That's what he did. The only difference between what Dr. Gosnell did and the nation was outraged over and he went to prison for life for murder, and what the partial birth abortionists are doing now is the location of the head of the child. And for some bizarre reason, we have said, well, if the head's not all the way out, it's only a partial birth, and so you can suck the child's brains out, crush its skull, and say that was legal. That's where we are in the United States. Well, the location of the head. There are other ways that they abort this. We've turned our eyes and we have condemned others. And all I can say is we need to be willing to stand up for this. And this is wrong. All abortion is wrong. And we're going to be increasingly marginalized, although they say that there is a changing spirit in America. Pray for it. Take a stand wherever you can. We have lost this natural, now I don't say we as a group, but as a nation, there's the loss of this natural affection. One more. There are other natural affections, but can I give you the one that ought to be the greatest? Yeah, husband and wife, that ought to be there. Moms to their babies ought to be there. The society for their children ought to be there. But there's also the natural affection for God. Now, if somebody had saved me from a horrible fiery death, pulling me out of a house, and with no other buddy there that could help me, I ought to love that person till the day I die. I ought to be willing to tell them that all the time. I would have a natural affection because of what they had done for me. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He said, I'm going to make it really simple. You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then you are to love your neighbor as yourself. And so as far as natural affection, we ought to first love God because of what He did for us. And in the last days, we see that there will be a loss of that natural affection. As a matter of fact, let me get to the verse. I'm not going to read the rest of verses 3 and 4. It starts listing all of the terrible things that will happen in the last days. I just wanted that first one where it says, without love, you can in your margin write, without natural affection. That's really what that word means. Askoros, which is the Greek word. But in verse 5, let me sum it up. It says, in the end times there will be terrible times in the last days, having, verse 5, a form of godliness, but denying its power. So you say, okay, so we'll have a form of godliness. Let me rephrase it. They will have religion without power. John Wesley, when he started this great Wesleyan revival that led to the Nazarenes, the Methodists, and all this group on the Holiness movement, he said his greatest fear is that in the future people would have religion but without power. And when I look across America and I see churches that are struggling, I see churches that have tried to not offend their society. They've tried to be politically correct, And the trade-off was they lost their power. Now, what does a form of godliness without power look like? Well, the first thing is, it denies that Jesus has the power to save souls. You want powerless religion, is any religion, any denomination, any church, any Christian that doesn't believe Jesus Christ brings salvation. They offer a lot of stuff, but they can't offer salvation. They can offer a lot of activities, but they don't offer salvation. The second thing that's powerless is a religion that tries to limit the power of the Holy Spirit to the explainable. You'll keep hearing unexplainable from me. I am so delighted to be at this church because knowing myself and how little I bring and knowing some of the challenges we have as a church face, I am standing back and saying, God, when it happens, you're going to get the credit because it's unexplainable in a human sense. And so go get them, God. Go get them, God. I want to see the unexplainable. I see also a powerless religion, number 3, that gets distracted from its mission. And number 4, lastly, that loses its natural affection for God. Now, I've got to close this, and we're going to go to communion now. When I close this, I have to look at this church that Timothy was pastoring. You see, this was a letter to a pastor. Paul, being inspired by God, was saying, Timothy, I have a message from God to you. You were the pastor of the first church in Ephesus, the church I helped start, Paul says. And he's going through all of this, and he says, but I need to tell you, we're in the last days, and it will be terrible times in the last days, and one of the things will be that they will have a form of godliness. In other words, they'll all go to church on Sunday, and they'll all look good, but lacking the power therein. And let me suggest that that power comes from a loss of love in Jesus Christ. And so in the book of Revelation, 7 messengers were sent to 7 of their churches and said, here's a message for you specifically. And there was a message to this church in Ephesus where Timothy was pastor. And here's what it said. He said, I commend you for a lot of the good things you did. You addressed heretics. You threw them out when you needed to. You worked hard. You persevered. It seems like you never grew weary in doing well. You endured hardship for my name and have not grown weary. But he said, but I got this against you. I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. When we look at churches, I look at this and say, was that church successful? I said, no. It was a colossal failure. Why? Because they lost their first love. They just went through the motions of religion. The lesson for us, we're in a culture war. Let me sum it up. We're in a culture war. And next week we're going to look at the culture's war on God, the existence of God. And the week after that, the culture's war on creation. And then we're going to look at the hard question of suffering. How would a loving God allow such suffering? Then we're going to look at universal salvation. Is there really a hell, or do we all make it in the sweet by and by? You know, does every religion, us and the Hindus and Mormons and Muslims, we're all going to be in heaven? God will just give everybody a do-over. We're going to take a peek at that because we're in a society that believes in do-overs, you know, a spiritual mulligan. But as I close this, the issue are these 2 great cultural issues. One, holy matrimony, traditional marriage, purity within marriage. And the lesson for us is we need to be kind to the sinner. We need to be loving to the sinner. But we also need to call sin, sin. And part of that call is the heterosexual sin, to make sure that we don't pick and choose which one. And the other part is that we need to be willing to take a stand for the unborn, even if nobody else does. We will continue to say it. It may not be politically correct. It may be in variance to what 5 people on the Supreme Court said, but it is in absolute concordance with what God said. And I'm willing to stand for God. The third one was we need to love Jesus. And that church in Ephesus forgot. They just forgot. Jesus said, I know you guys forget. So I'm going to ask you to do something that will help you remember. He said, I'm going to have this ceremony, if you will. We call it communion. And during that ceremony, I want you to remember what I did for you. Is that too much to ask? And so we're going to gather. And if you're a believer and you're with us, you don't have to be a member. Would you join us together? Join together as we celebrate the Lord's table.